And I have internet finally. Thank you. Good evening. Welcome to the regular meeting of the Brisbane Planning Commission, Thursday, June 12th, 2014, 7:30 p.m. Call to order.
Commissioner Cunningham?
Present.
Commissioner Doe?
Present.
Commissioner Menier?
Here.
Commissioner Parker?
Here.
Records show Commissioner Reinhardt is absent.
Adoption of the agenda.
I move to adopt the agenda.
I second that motion.
All in favour?
Aye.
Aye.
Moving on to written communications, the HIP Housing Home Sharing Program Memorandum dated February 2014. Also on my desk, I have a copy of the Crocker Park Technical Assistance Panel from the Urban Land Institute. Glad to see that. I also have a magazine from the Western City Technology, Western City, the monthly magazine of the League of California Cities, Technology Tools and Techniques, and a printout I'm assuming is for something later on the city relative to our housing alternatives. Anybody else got anything on there that I didn't see?
Written communication?
No. In the written communications.
I mean oral communication.
Oh, I'm sorry. Missed that all together. So we have oral communications. That will be a limit to a total of 15 minutes for anything that is not on our agenda. Would anybody like to speak in oral communications in our audience? Okay, we'll close oral communications. Sorry about that. So we can move on to new business. Public hearing, Freeway 101 Beatty Avenue, use permit, UP 214. Interim use permit for existing billboard to remain for 5 years. Robert Hatton, Clear Channel Outdoor applicant. Oyster Point Universal Paragon Corporation owner, APN 005-340-050.
Yes, thank you. The applicant requests approval of an interim use permit for an existing billboard. This would be to remain for an additional 5 years. The structure is oriented to Highway 101 and is located approximately 100 feet south of Beatty Avenue at 101. It consists of 2 illuminated sign faces of 23 feet by 60 feet, each at a 65-degree angle to the freeway with a total height of 55 feet. As part of a legal settlement dating back to 1983, the city, and this was in response to the city's enforcement of a prohibition on 6 existing billboards, and 6 were removed in the lawsuit. Essentially allowed for the city council to conditionally approve this billboard via use permit back at that time. The original use permit was granted for a 6-year term, and the applicant was allowed to apply for additional extensions, which it has over the years. The findings are outlined in the agenda report, and I'll highlight a couple of the key ones here. One is that the sign not have detrimental effects on the neighborhood or city, and no material changes have occurred at the Bayland sub-area, and allowing the billboard to remain would not have any detrimental effects. Another is that the billboard would not obstruct or delay intended redevelopment of the property, which it's not anticipated to, and there's a condition of approval that addresses that the applicant enter an agreement to remove the billboard should that be needed. And finally, that the use provides a benefit to the city, which could include revenues. According to the city finance department, the annual business license fee for this billboard has averaged about $47,000 for the last 5 years. So in closing, staff recommends approval of the interim use permit via the resolution containing the findings and conditions of approval.
Okay, thanks. Do you have any questions for staff? No?
No, I don't.
No?
No.
Can we hear from the applicant?
Good evening, Madam Chairwoman Cunningham. My name is Robert Hatton. I'm with Clear Channel Outdoor. Just like to say, or like to thank Ken for his thoughtful and thorough staff report, and I'll let you know I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. I should note that the conditions, we've reviewed the conditions upon which we would be approved and are absolutely fine with all of them. Should also note that our landlord, the Universal Paragon Corporation, has reviewed our application, reviewed our status, and let us know that a 5-year extension would not interfere with any of their plans for the site.
Okay. Any questions for the applicant?
I have no questions.
I have one question. Is there any proposed changes to the materials that will be used or anything relative to illumination or anything like that to the billboard moving forward?
No, absolutely not. We will use the same materials. The only changes we would make would be customary maintenance. If we need to replace decks that the workmen actually design on and such. But no, we don't plan any changes to the illumination system or any of the materials we use to work on the sign or advertise with on the sign.
Okay, thank you.
So that's safe to assume that you continue to recycle the way you're currently recycling?
Yes. The vinyl that we use, switch out at this location on a every other month basis or so is always recycled.
Thank you.
Okay, would anybody like to make a motion on this then?
I motion
Through the
to,
chair, through the chair, you have one other audience member. I don't know if he'd like to
Open the public
speak on
hearing.
this.
I'm sorry.
No, okay.
I'm sorry. Thank you very much. Okay. Procedurally, we will open the public hearing, and as there is nobody who wishes to speak on the public hearing, make a motion to close the public hearing.
Second that motion?
All in favor?
Aye.
aye.
What is your pleasure?
Okay, this particular application came before me several times. I think this is the third or fourth time I'm looking at it. In the past, I was a little bit concerned about how it's going to affect the Universal Paragon's project. But since it's not going anywhere, I don't see any reason to deny this. Also, I think that is there any possible way we can extend the time from 5 years to until the development is in place, because it's the same routine every 5 years.
Good question. It is limited to 5 years in the zoning ordinance, so interim use permits are a limit of 5 years. That's the maximum.
Because it's just the formality now. And I don't know when the project going to go through the Bayshore Universal Paragon, nowhere near that. So if that's the procedure, they just have to follow that, I guess.
Right.
So I make a motion to, anybody else has any comments?
I have no comments.
Yeah, let's make a motion to approve this.
Have a second?
I'll second it.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Good luck. I'm sure I'm still around.
Thank you. My internet is spotty and I keep losing my place. Excuse me here.
Study session, no?
Okay, thank you. I'm back there now. Moving on to item G, study session. 2015 to 2022 Housing Element Update Study, number 5, Part 2, Chapter 3, Land Inventory and Identification of Adequate Sites for Regional Housing Needs, Appendix F, housing sites inventory, opportunity sites for residential development.
And the lights here. The subject of this housing element study session, is to address the housing inventory and identification of sites for potential housing, which is Chapter 3 and its associated appendix, Chapter F. It especially addresses how the city will meet its share of the regional housing needs allocation, also referred to as the RENA. The Planning Commission undertook the first part of this study session on April 24th and provided direction to staff, and that was on a preliminary basis. It included the 3 lots that were previously designated in the previous housing element for rezoning to mixed use, and that's immediately north of the community park, proposed as a NCRO 3 district. It would also include rezoning the 3 lots along the south side of Park Lane behind the post office, and that we're proposing as an R4 district designation. For completeness, the Planning Commission expressed interest in further discussing alternative sites prior to providing their recommendation to City Council. A draft of the housing element, Table 35, has been provided to the Commission in the agenda report, and that provides a snapshot of how the current zoning combined with those preliminary proposed rezoning sites compares with the RENA. This image I have on the screen now, you also have a paper copy of in front of you. As requested by the Planning Commission, the alternative sites of the Southwest Bayshore, they include the Southwest Bayshore sub-area at the east end and also at the east end of Marina Boulevard and the Sierra Point sub-area. These were indicated in the agenda report for the Planning Commission's discussion. Also, since this housing element provides an opportunity for the Planning Commission to consider sites that are related by proximity and to allow for a holistic policy direction, a few other sites are included and are listed on Table A of your report, and we'll get into some slides that include that Table A data at the end here. These sites may or may not include housing, but due to their proximity to the proposed NCRO 3 and R4 districts, further discussion is warranted. The sites included for the discussion then in this study session are, just very briefly, the NCRO 3 as mentioned, the R4 district as mentioned, Brisbane Village Shopping Center, the Bank of America site, which would be both of those near the or adjacent to the NCRO 3, the post office site, the north side of Park Lane, the 3 warehouses just opposite of the proposed R4, the former VWR location, Southwest Bayshore sites, and what's a vacant site is the 9000 Marina Boulevard at the east end of Sierra Point. Go back to this slide for a minute. As a reminder, during the 2007 to 14 housing element period, the city had committed to rezoning to meet some of its RENA, and since the city will not have adopted the rezoning during that time period, that portion of the RENA must be carried forward to this housing element. And in accordance with state law, the rezoning of those districts must be done by January of 2016. So the summary is provided on the screen there, and you can see the sum total is 293 for the current RENA cycle or our upcoming one, plus the carryover. The bottom notes there, the RENA, and this is really the driver for rezoning, is the RENA for the very low to moderate income. The shortfall there is 225 units, and of these, 50% may be in mixed use. And just a note, what the Planning Commission has proposed on that preliminary basis would meet all of this shortfall, plus some. So the Planning Commission may keep the currently proposed rezoning shown on Table 35 as a recommendation to City Council, or it may add or modify that recommendation based on further discussion here tonight. That attached Table A shows the rain as a shortfall again. And the, actually, sorry, we'll jump forward to Table A is here, and there's 4 sheets of this. These are broken out from what you have in your paper report. So the range on these, as shown in the table, is 20 units as a minimum to meet the state requirements, and 30 units as a maximum. And that 30 units as a maximum is essentially taking what is currently the maximum zoning in the R3 district and applying it here. Just as a point of reference, the Planning Commission can recommend higher density if it chooses on given sites to allow for flexibility on other sites and concentrate. So this table essentially just provides that range of that. As I mentioned, the deadline is January 2016. And given the short time frame, in order for the city to have more flexibility in how it rezones, the program language has been modified to take out the reference, as we previously discussed, to form-based codes and keep it more open-ended as to how the city approaches that in the future. So depending on the results from tonight's study session, we may come back again on this, or if the commission settles on proposed recommendations to City Council, we would come back with a complete housing element draft that you would review in its entirety and then provide recommendation to City Council. Staff has also provided here a rough draft of a policy that you might consider to address sites that are near or adjacent to the proposed rezoning sites, if those are to be settled on tonight. I'll just read it here. Consider zoning ordinance amendments for non-residential sites in the immediate vicinity of sites designated for rezoning to residential or mixed use, which may be impacted by or have an impact on those sites. And that's to encourage compatible uses and development. So it's essentially given you language to address rezoning of those other nearby sites without actually committing those sites to residential uses, but just saying that we will consider what's best, and we're not wanting to lock ourselves in on any specific zoning in the future. So this is something that staff is just putting out there for your consideration, but you may choose to provide more specific policy direction if you choose, or this is up for discussion. So with that, I'll open it up for discussion, and we can kind of toggle through these pages if it helps, and also you have the paper map. So I'm thinking, since we don't have 2 screens here, to have the map and the table, you can kind of use the paper for the map, and I can toggle through this if that's a help. But so with that, I'll leave it open to your discussion or questions.
Thank you. Carolyn?
I have a question. So the Northeast Ridge is going to have how many more houses? It's going to meet the above moderate income for the next few years, the remaining houses to be built, do you know?
These are above moderate income, so market rate housing. And staff left those off the table at this time because 2 reasons. They're not really a driver. They don't meet any of the low or low to moderate income categories. So they're not really driving any of the policy kind of direction that you'll be headed for tonight. Also, staff is not exactly sure how the numbers will come in by the end of the year. So we're kind of going to wait and see, and we'll add those in as needed. I'm guessing we might have, there might be another 30 units that would show up as market rate through the Northeast Ridge, and that those Toll Brothers is projecting, I think it's about the end of next summer, so about a year and a quarter from now, that they'll probably be, they're thinking they'll be all done with those. So I think there will be some housing units to show in this housing element, but they're not really a driver for meeting those low mod requirements.
Well, my comment then is that the Marina Boulevard does not really meet the requirements except that they're asking for, because there's no real access to transportation, to shopping centers. You know, it's kind of isolated out there. And so I see that if we look at we're meeting the criteria, I think, fundamentally for the above moderate income. So I question whether we should even be looking at Marina Boulevard, because it really doesn't meet any of the requirements necessary for low and moderate income housing, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, it has a number of challenges, I think, associated as you all noted there, and you know, technically, yes, you could, if the city had the desire, zone it for the minimum density and it meets the minimum size, but it does have other challenges associated with it that kind of, in a way, similar to Southwest Bayshore. It had unique challenges which were much different than this, but this has other issues. And I think one of the big ones is really, you know, a couple things. City Council considered this site previously, and it really didn't gain any traction in the last housing element cycle, so whether the will is there for that at this time. The other is the design guidelines and whether housing really would fit for the with the, I guess, the long-term vision, and especially with the design guidelines really still being in play and the vision still being decided to some degree. It raises questions.
As far as the transportation concern, shouldn't that be part of the discussion when they come before us as to what they want to do? Might be a lot of alternative transportation modes that we can suggest or recommend, like carpooling or providing a shuttle service to the nearest bus stop. So that part can still be addressed, right?
Are you referring to with the actual?
The marina, for example, if we do decide to go with that, when they come before us with the development agreement, will we require certain conditions to be met, including providing the carpool or some kind of a ride sharing, or some way to get to the nearest transportation hub? And that will pretty much eliminate that concern that we have, because a lot of parts of Brisbane right now are not very close to the transportation. Everybody has to drive. The nearest bus station is on Bayshore, so people living on the hill, they have to drive. So it's no different in my opinion. If we plan properly, we can require the developer to provide that kind of means. As far as the shopping is concerned, it's no different than what we have in here. There's only one supermarket here. Everybody has to go to Tenfriend or some other shopping mall to to get the groceries. So that part is not there either. The reason I'm saying that this will be a good site is because this whole area has been underdeveloped for such a long time, and nothing has been done. And if you keep the status quo the way it is, then city is losing a lot of potential for some kind of a tax gain here. So we need to look at the alternate ways to bring up this area so we can utilize that. Right now it's just dusty. There's nothing going on.
What I'm saying is, for the purposes of this housing element requirement, it doesn't really, we could look at it, but it doesn't really meet the requirements because we already have in excess, or we have ample amount of the moderate and, the above moderate housing already. So I think for my purposes, I think we should concentrate on areas that would meet the requirements for low and moderate income housing. That was
the point I'm trying to make here is if you do allow low to moderate income, you can require them to have certain low income housing in there as a part of the development agreement, which can help us in meeting our goal. Because it's not absolute that they will get whatever is above minimum.
If we meet the standards of this, then it should be on a transportation grid. Is that correct?
Well, through the chair, just make sure we're all talking about the same thing.
That's what I'm thinking.
I think there are a couple things that you want to keep in mind is that the state requirements for what we get, quote unquote, credit for low or moderate density, something beyond or below market rate, is based on the density that you zone the property. So if you were to zone that site on the marina, at Marina Boulevard, to more than 20 units to the acre, we would get credit for purposes of this housing element exercise as potentially low, moderate income units. So that's, mathematically, if it were zoned to that density, we could theoretically get credit. That, the question of whether you think it's a good idea or a bad idea or appropriate or inappropriate is really more, the discussion for you to have and make that determination. But if you zone it at 20 units to the acre or greater, we would get credit for purposes of this exercise.
Well, my confusion then is, I thought one of the requirements was to get the credit, it needed to be on a transportation grid. Is that correct? No?
No.
Where did I get that idea?
No.
Okay.
I think there's, again,
I misunderstood then.
You're applying a very commonsensical, a very common sense rationale, but that's not something that the state requires. So,
Okay.
if you choose to use that as part of your reasoning or your rationale, it makes a lot of sense, but it's not a state requirement.
Oh, all right. My apologies.
Ben? Okay, relative to the Marina Boulevard property, so this is just all hypothetical then, and we could say this is great for discussion purposes and for coming up with numbers, but it's not real?
What you're doing here is recommending rezoning or sites to be rezoned to meet our housing needs for the next RENA cycle into the housing element. So if you're recommending that site be rezoned for housing, that would be your recommendation to the city council. It's not something you're just throwing out there. You're either recommending it or you're not recommending it. So, if you don't think it's a good idea, and that's really the purpose of these workshops and your process is to really sort through that and decide what you think the best decision is, not just to put it out there and we'll be in a position like we were with Southwest Bayshore in a year and say, oh, well, we did that, but maybe it isn't such a good idea, and then we end up sort of back to square one, and that's not where we want to be again.
So if we are looking at what is already on the table, plus the additional properties on Park Lane, and we come up with some numbers relative to density in those areas, we're going to make the numbers we need, correct? from my...
Yes, the numbers that are included in the Table 35 that you have in your staff report include just those sites, and at the densities that are indicated, we would meet we would meet and exceed the minimum requirement for the state.
Anybody want to have a conversation about that? I'd like to direct the conversation to what we've already identified and talk about that relative to reality versus hypotheticals. I mean, I think, you know, VWR and 9000 Marina Boulevard are kind of hypothetical at this point. I would prefer to stick with something that was a little bit more realistic, that we're not just making up stuff for the heck of it. So can we get back to the whole area that is already has infrastructure? We've had a lot of discussions that have gone back for a long, long time about, you know, redirecting traffic, what was brought up at, you know, many meetings over the last 10 years or more. Can we discuss that a little bit more amongst ourselves? How you feel about it? Carolyn, do you want to start?
Well, I was kind of intrigued by the idea of whether to increase the density to above 20. And I did have some questions about some of the other areas that had zoning up to 35. And I'm trying to remember what the streets were. They were on, I should have put the numbers, I'm sorry.
Would be the R3 districts, which includes most of San Bruno Avenue and a strip that runs along close to the community park as well. Plumas Street, which you saw a proposal recently for that, is R3.
You're talking about increasing the density in those areas?
No, I was asking about some of the other areas that had been, there's some apartment buildings that were built on, and they just vanished out of my head. I should have written them down. Up off of San Bruno Avenue.
There was a note in the report about that
From the
a
70s.
previous zoning
Right.
that was up over 40. I believe it was 43.
It was 35 or something.
Is that correct?
Yeah. So I have a question about that. How much, in the end, what was the density in those areas? Do you remember, or you have any idea?
Do you recall, Tim?
No?
It's up there, though. It's clearly over 30 units.
It's clearly over 30.
Was the R4 district, the zoning regulations allowed 1 unit per 1,000 square feet?
Right.
And I think, actually, you know, you have existing apartment buildings along Visitation that are denser than that. There's some that have 1 unit per 800.
The apartment buildings. The apartment buildings you're talking about? Mm-hmm.
We have examples of that high density multiple family development already.
Any questions here? Any comments?
Well, I was thinking of whether we would want to increase the density. It can be between 20 and 30, I think. Is that what you're saying? Up to 30, and so that we could allow for more open space, you know, and create more of a kind of a village within a village.
Yeah.
So that was one thought I had.
Well, that was our original discussion of the, you know, the live-work loft situation, working below, people meandering cafes and all that kind of stuff, and apartments above, correct? Is that where you're heading mentally with that?
I didn't have anything envisioned per se, but I was just thinking that we could, I was thinking that it may be preferable to increase the density up to 30 rather than a lesser number.
Do we have any visual capacity on that? If we said, okay, it was 30 in those spaces, do we have any visual mock-ups that would give us an idea what that would look like or how that would play out?
We could come back with, there are a lot of sort of these models that show certain kind of densities and product types, what kind of product types go with those densities, and visually, if you think that would be helpful, we could come back with that at the next meeting and do some illustrations. I don't want to speak to Ken. You're aware of what I'm talking about. Right. You can pull those together, if not for the next meeting, certainly before you have a decision to make.
Right.
I think the point's well taken. It may be the question of you don't want to cap the upper end, because again, if it's really more of a form-based, whether it's form-based coding or some other tool, that if you're more interested in the look and the character, the yield of the number of lots and number of units is secondary, right, to its physical form and appearance. So a well-designed project at a higher density can sometimes be more visually appealing than a less well-designed lower density project. So I think the idea of maybe not capping the top end in terms of to 30, provide a little flexibility for excellence in design that fits is something that should be considered. I'd be a little leery about, upping the minimum, because, that we're really establishing as a minimum density of 20 to the acre. I don't know if we'd want to be in a position of upping the minimum to 30 or something without knowing what that product might look like. So there's not the few things for you to consider.
No, I agree with that. And so the maximum we could increase it to would be 30 or 35?
You can decide the maximum. The state just requires a minimum for it to count towards the RENA, but it's really up to the city. Once it hits the 20 mark, any number above that is up to the city's discretion. So if you wanted to increase the density, say, to 40 or something like that on a certain part, and then other parts have it at 20, that's really up to you as a recommendation to council. So really, the 20 and above is fair game. The question then becomes, how dense do you want it to have that sort of trade-off? And let me also kind of throw something else out. When the 24 units per acre was designated for the proposed NCRO 3 district across from the community park, that was to find that balance of total housing sites to meet the RENA in the last cycle. You're not stuck at 24 units. You could actually, to allow more, say for instance, seems that's mixed use, if you wanted to lower that density down to 20 and pick up those sites elsewhere and have more flexibility to have more commercial space in that district, you could lower that to 20 and pick it up in the, say, the R4 district. And I did I meant to do this before, but some quick math, and based on what we have now, you could potentially lower that to 20 units and still meet the RENA and give yourself some flexibility there.
Because looking at NCRO 3, it's already at 24 units per acre. So visually, it would be really helpful to compare that to the 20 units per acre in R4, just to see, again, what the possibilities are and how much each unit is actually looking at in terms of living space.
Yeah, as John mentioned, there's all kinds of different designs and types, and so a lot is really driven by an application coming in the door. I would say that, if that's the flexibility that you want is to allow for more commercial, you might want to consider reducing that density. But But staff could come back with some examples, some types.
Can we do
Fine.
it? Because those two areas, one is mixed use, like you were pointing out, and one is residential use. So can we do 24 units for the mixed use and 20 units for the mixed use compared to the 20 units for the residential use and 24 units for the residential use? So we can have kind of like,
Through the chair, I think we can do that, but I think what you'll find is these kind of prototypical, to cut between 20 and 24 to the acre is really a fairly fine design change. I mean, normally talking about what 12 to 15 looks like versus 20 to 25 to the acre versus 40 to the acre. Those are the kind of gross. We're not going to be able to give you an example, a very fine-grained example of what 16 to the acre versus 20 versus 24 looks like. I mean, so I don't want to get your expectations up. We can look at what's out there, but normally you're looking at a broader range, because a lot of these things are very finely driven by how big a unit is. Is it 2 bedrooms? Is it a family unit? Is it a studios? That have a lot to do with ultimately its final configuration. So I don't know that we're ever going to be able to give you sort of samples, but 4 units to the acre that you'll be able to tell much of an appreciable difference. But we'll try to get, there are some good graphic tools out there, and we hopefully that will help you at least sort of get an order of magnitude type difference.
thank you for that clarification. And also, to follow up on that, you were saying that these, in order to get the credit as per RENA, we would have to have X number of units, right? But you were saying, is there, I guess, could you please remind me whether there is a requirement when we talk about low income or very low income? Is there a requirement for the number of family members that you're servicing? So it could be, technically it could be a studio, and we would meet that criteria. So that's again something, I mean, if we're really going to go beyond hypothetical and into the practical, how many people, how many members of the community are we really servicing? That would be something.
Right. The state doesn't specify number of bedrooms or square footage of an actual development. They do have, of course, the 20 units an acre, as we talked about, and also a minimum site size that at that density it's going to accommodate at least 16 housing units, which all of these sites would do that.
So unit-based, not family member-based.
Right.
Just to make sure I'm understanding correctly.
That's correct.
Yeah, I can interrupt. There's also kind of I don't think there's a disconnect yet, but the state, this whole minimum density requirement is relatively new. I think it came up in the 2007 housing element. And so you have this sort of assumed affordability kind of, you basically full credit, but what some jurisdictions are actually building housing, they may build a project at 20 units to the acre, but the units are not, that's not a 20-unit affordable project, right? No one's building full affordable projects. So it's an interesting how they're getting credited or getting discredited, I guess, when their zoning allowed for this many low mod units, but when it got built, it only had 9, right? The state assumed they'd get 20 and they only build 9. So, I mean, the idea, it's kind of cautionary for us, a planning commission and a staff sitting here in 5 years or 7 years, if some of these things happen and the numbers, what we thought we'd get credit for, don't jibe with what actually happens, depending on what does happen. So it's kind of a cautionary tale, and it's also kind of a reminder that some of these state requirements aren't tied to a sort of reality to some extent. I mean, they do the best they can, but I don't think we want to kid ourselves that these are very reality-based kind of objectives and goals.
Right. And it feeds into the question of where we want as a community to have our vision, right? Because then the housing units actually directly affect who is going to be living in there. So are you talking about younger professionals? Are you talking about maybe a transient population that comes and goes within 5 or 6 years? Or you're talking about a family-based vision, right? So it affects a lot of where we want to as a community. So I agree with Karen that if we were to do that, we would really need to go beyond the hypothetical and into at least have the discussion about the practical.
Well, I think absolutely. Once doesn't matter, once you establish some areas for zoning, whether it's mixed use or R4 or what have you, somebody is going to have to come in who wants to actually produce that product, and that's when it's going to get into, whether these are family units or studios and how they see to integrate the mixed use with the living space. And yeah, absolutely, and that'll be a part of the process to some extent, that the back and forth that has to happen before a project actually gets built.
Jamil, do you have any comments?
No.
I think sort of summing up what we've been talking about, I think what might be useful for all of us is, well, at least for me, I'm a very visual learner. So from a visual perspective, I think it would be really helpful to know what does 20 units look like, what does 30 units look like, and if we can't go to 20 to 24 because we're not going to see any significant difference, say 20 to then 30, whatever that makes sense. I think what else would be really useful to know is if there were 20 or 30, what kind of traffic is attributed to that density at this point? What does that look like? What does that look like on the streets that are in place right now? What does that look like if something in the TAP is adopted and Old County Road ends up going straight across to Bayshore from the bottom of Old County Road through, how do I describe that so if anybody is listening to what we're talking about, they'll understand what I'm saying. Can you describe that?
I think you're making perfect sense.
Oh, thanks. Might not to people who don't know what we're talking about, though. From the, can you?
Show the graph
Of the TAP, I can put it on the screen.
You know what I'm talking
Yeah.
about, that proposed road extension?
Yeah, I was just looking at
Oh, on here,
sort of with the
on
pointer,
my way
just
back to
kinda
the,
show.
So where
Essentially,
vegetation comes down
here's
to Old County and crosses.
Road here, and you'd have a road coming straight on through. And I'm wobbly at this distance, sorry about that, but essentially cutting through. And what they have proposed is not just the sites, but essentially this whole section in here becoming a mixed-use kind of a district. So essentially this whole core of Brisbane would change over time.
Right. So if we could get more information on that to us so we can better discuss it and maybe have some community input on that discussion would be great.
I think that's a very good point because it revolves around that whole area.
Oh, absolutely. It's going to change a lot of things. Whatever happens there is going to change traffic flow throughout Brisbane. I would assume if anything is going to happen there, we would be looking at diverting as much traffic away from the residential part of Brisbane to the bottom end of town. I mean, there's a lot of different things that could occur if the development's there. I think, personally, this is the best place for us to be looking because the infrastructure is in place and we can probably have pretty good control of it. It also, anything that happens there relative to small businesses or homes, the people are already tied to town, and it kind of ekes out a little bit more towards the northeast ridge homes as well. There's somewhat of a tie-in starts to occur.
I think you are right that we should be concentrating this area, but at the same time, if we have a chance to look at the other areas, we should not discard that because this whole process comes every several years, and it's our opportunity to look at the others also and see what can in future we do. But you are right, this particular area in the red is the most viable area that we can do right now.
Well, I spoke with one of our realtors, and it was Joel Davis, about the idea of TWR and
BWR?
TWR, excuse me.
Is it Ron Davis or Joel Diaz you spoke with?
Joel Diaz.
Okay.
And he was saying that it's rather difficult to be a realtor selling homes in areas that have a train around it. He said that they don't sell well, they don't sell easily. They are generally for first, someone trying to enter the market. And so I only spoke briefly with him about it, but I was kind of interested in his thoughts about what he thought about that particular area.
I think if you look at the entire peninsula, there are so many homes all along the railroad tracks, and they are not affected that much. So
Well, he was saying actually they were.
No, not that significantly, because the demand is so high that people, it happened in the Southern California also, the same concern was raised. But as it turned out that people, when there is a need for the housing, they will go there. Market value will be maybe $10,000 less than what you can get away from there, but the market is there.
Well, I was thinking after I spoke with him, and this is I also want to say, is I lived right on a train line, which was the Muni. I was...
The whole San Francisco is like that.
I was 3 homes away from the Muni stop, so, all night long we'd hear the Muni come by, and it would actually rattle the house. So, anyway, I thought I would bring that up since I did speak with him.
Because that's why they have sound walls now all along the freeways and railroad right-of-ways to prevent the sound coming directly to the closer homes. But studies show that it's not next to the railroad tracks, but people away from that, they get more sound. So nighttime, if you see there's a Caltrain, Union Pacific Railroad coming, I can hear all the way in my house there, much louder because the sound propagates upward. So there are studies being done on that, and people argue one way or the other.
And I live on Tulare Street facing the train station, the train tracks, and it doesn't bother us. So,
Well, since I spoke with him, I thought I would,
What bothers me is those
bring it up.
absolutely.
what bothers me is those strong signals that they put in, the red ones, that really shine. You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And I don't know why they have to be on 24/7 on that. But
All right, we're getting off track here.
yeah.
So back to this discussion. Anybody else have any other comments or direction that we can?
Well, I
Ask-
think we should talk about what Commissioner Manure, whether the rest of the commission wants to discuss these 2 areas.
Okay, well,
I'm not ready at this point to discuss the 2 areas.
okay. Done?
I don't have anything to add to that.
Jamil, do you want to make your case on these 2 pieces of property that nobody else wants to talk about right now?
Well, I thought it was a good idea when we have the opportunity to look at it, and these are potential sites that can be, in case if nothing works out here, at least we have something to fall back. But, if we are confident that we can do something in the red areas, I'm okay either way.
Okay,
Because the main reason was that by putting that, it will give us something to start thinking. If we don't put that at all, then people forget,
Absolutely. And whatever sort of sites you choose not to pursue as part of this particular update, there'll still be documentation in the document that you considered these sites and chose not to advance them. So, they'll be tracking in there. It might be that, right, it's the next commission in so many years wants to revisit that, and circumstances have changed, and it makes sense to them at that point.
right, it doesn't get taken off the table, it's just not on the table for now, correct? Okay, I would like as much additional information, positive and negative, that the staff can provide to us for the next discussion relative to this? Because I think it's a good place to go forward and explore a little further from my perspective.
I also want to look at the TAP report.
Yeah.
Before really looking at this point, since that has come out.
Right. So looking at, now that the TAP report is available to us, how does that figure into where we proceed relative to this discussion?
Well, at this point, it's background information. The report itself will be reviewed by the City Council's, I think, their Economic Development Subcommittee, where this sort of all came from.
Mm-hmm.
They'll make specific recommendations to the council as to sort of the policy direction they want to take. And assuming there are certain policy directions the council wants that would require, subsequent planning commission action that would flow through to you. It could be that, this housing element process does have kind of a very short lifespan. We need to get this done and moved on. Mm-hmm. It might be that the council's review, especially over their schedule, is kind of light. They don't meet a lot over the summer. So it may be that they're not really able to give this a lot of consideration until maybe even the fall. So I think you need to move forward based on the best kind of information you have at hand. It may be that sort of the TAP information somewhat dovetails with your recommendations on the housing element. So I think it's valuable information, but nothing in there has been sort of blessed by the City Council at this point.
So potentially we should read this and figure it into our next discussion.
I would like to, I agree, I'd like to see just what kind of density graphs you have before we move forward.
I'm having difficulty visualizing it, and I usually can, and for some reason I can't wrap my visual head around what that would all look like.
Well, I was going to ask if anybody has any idea what the density is on one of the Altamar buildings. I really have no clue.
You're talking about the
apartment
condos?
buildings.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
That's a good thing. We'll research that and provide that.
Okay, because, and maybe a couple of the other apartment buildings in the city, so we can just kind of get an idea.
Also, it may not be a bad idea to have some good examples and some bad examples.
Right.
What have the people have done. So that we can all get the idea, this is not what we want to do.
What we want to avoid?
Yeah.
Right.
Well, we want it to be Brisbane, and comfortable.
Right.
What
And
works
special.
and what doesn't.
Yeah, what does work.
Yeah, what works and what doesn't.
Yeah, there are some in Colma I can name.
So to recap,
Yep.
basically we'll get some examples in the city that to the degree that we have them, that show that 20 unit kind of range as well as the 30 units or above even range. The traffic impacts that those densities might pose. And as it stands at this point in time, and it's still open into the next meeting, is we're looking at the same probably sites, but that's still open for discussion. And the policy that I mentioned, if you have any feedback on that, or if you want to ponder it further for the next meeting, which would be, as I mentioned, for those sites that are adjacent to, at the time that we're rezoning the sites that are designated for housing, that we at least consider those sites and how the zoning might dovetail. And so it's fairly general language and intended that way. So if you have any thoughts on that,
Great.
either tonight or into the next meeting.
Probably next meeting.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, one of my concerns with this whole thought process is not undermining the uses that are already in the area. For example, in San Francisco, there was a famous bar that was in Point A for many, many years, for 50 years. And then suddenly zoning changed around that bar and housing went in. Well, you know, when the housing went in, then all the moms and dads complained about the noise from the bar, and the bar went out of business. I don't think we should be contemplating things that are going to be destructive to existing uses, unless the people who are in those places are happy to relocate somewhere else. I think that would be opening up a huge can of worms. I just want to be sensitive to what is existing, who's there from my perspective. And when you're doing that analysis for us, part of what we can have is mixed use. Can you factor that in when you're doing the 20 and 30 unit mock-ups, as well as, you know, if we had cafes at the bottom or live-work lofts, what would that look like? So it's not just a residential mock-up that you're doing, please?
Sure.
Okay.
Well, we already have a building that's really not that successful right now. Nothing has been put in the bottom unit, and that's across the street from the park. That was a mixed use.
Which building are you talking about?
The new one, the new
Oh,
condo.
yes, well,
I don't know why.
I don't know why either, but I agree.
There's been no one that's.
Have any clue why that's still vacant, John?
Well, I mean, I think if you look at the whole retail market in town is, you know, you've heard this anyway, instead of the TAP meeting or any talk to these commercial developers, it's rooftops, it's traffic, it's what's driving the retail. And you don't find that this community sort of in its state doesn't have the rooftops, frankly, to support a lot of retail.
I think I heard at the TAP meeting that to get a drugstore in here, we'd need a population of 15,000.
Instead of a ballpark, yeah.
Yeah.
Kind of numbers around.
So the question would be whether mixed use would be. We wouldn't be adding enough homes to, you know, justify mixed use on the bottom part and homes on top.
My thought on that was more that we would attract artists and people like that, so their studio would be below their home kind of thing. And that studio could end up being an art gallery of sorts of their own work or whatever, because I understand that we don't have enough population to support the businesses we already have, or the population we have don't support the businesses we have. It's probably a mix of both of those things. So when I was thinking mixed use, I was just envisaging artists showing their wares and using the bottom part as their workspace.
Well, it depends on what actually goes into Crocker Park, you know, whether we would have a daytime population. So that's something to think about.
Yeah. The other thing that came up through some of the TAP discussion too is if you were going to do mixed use on the 125 parcel,
Right.
that, you know, a design that took a little more advantage of its bayshore frontage, because you have a lot of trips along bayshore, would help support commercial when combined with, you know, a residential base or a daytime population.
Right.
There's the current shopping center, you know, you're on bayshore, but unless you want to come into town, you're not really going to access it. So, you know, there were those kind of design that some of the people in that business thought were a missed opportunity, frankly, of how some of the design that an alternate site might provide for.
Well, the question is how much people are stopping at some of the businesses on Bayshore in Brisbane.
Well, there's no access to any of these businesses from Bayshore right now. Is the people from the shopping center open to the idea of switching things around so maybe they could access the shopping center from Bayshore?
Well,
The discussion we had was relative to the new mixed-use site at 125.
125 only. Okay.
What's the experience of South San Francisco on Bayshore? They have a lot of businesses along there, mixed use also.
Pete's is always full. Pete's Coffee is always full.
Yeah, well, now along the Bayshore also, there are a lot of businesses and liquor stores and grocery stores and all that. So why we cannot have such a thing, that
I think that would be something that we could do a field trip and go ask the local merchants. Just how much business they're actually getting.
But, the problem we have is we don't have enough inventory of businesses here. As a result, if somebody wants to buy something, it's not available, they wind up going to the Colmo Center or somewhere else, because we have only one grocery store in the city.
But if we don't have the population for,
Well, if you attract some businesses like that, like Fresh and Easy and Spurs and all those kind of places, I'm sure the neighborhood people will come to shop if it's a unique type of stores.
I think our best bet is to have those facing Bayshore so they get the through traffic to survive.
maybe
the biggest-
I'll
biggest
buy some
other-
of the businesses and see how much people actually go in on Bayshore to their places. I noticed that the car dealership is empty, and, you're talking about South San Francisco, so.
Yeah, I'm just talking about Bayshore Boulevard, because that's where
That's what I'm talking about.
the
Yeah, I'm talking
parties
about-
are Linden.
I'm talking about the businesses that are in Bayshore, just going in and asking how much traffic they're actually
Because
getting.
the problem we have is Bank of America that really takes the very prime place,
Is that?
and it's sitting on the temporary building for that many years.
Uh-huh.
That's a separate
Yeah, I know,
question, right?
but I'm just saying that this is what one of the problems we have.
Okay. Any further discussion, Gustav? Okay, I think we're ready to move on.
So the last item, I guess.
Moving on to item H, and items initiated by staff.
The only thing I had was, we already touched upon, is the TAP report, and again, the process will go forward with the council. Excuse me, I'll keep you apprised. I don't know when their schedule, will allow for them to actually consider this, but be later in the summer at the very earliest, so I'm not really sure. The other thing was, I guess the council will be considering budget next week, so there is a number of budget meetings over the last few nights that you may or may not have seen, individual department budget presentations, but the council will be considering adoption of their budget for the next year at their upcoming meeting.
Do they have a discretionary spending pool?
I believe they did talk about setting something up for that.
Okay. Thank you. Moving on to item I, and items initiated by the commission. Caroline, Bun?
And nothing for me.
Nothing.
Any subcommittee updates? Anybody here on a subcommittee?
No.
Any news of when my subcommittee's reconvening?
I have to dedicate a good chunk of time to get it back to you, so my apologies.
No problem, just curious. Okay. Then with that, if there's nothing else, I make a motion to adjourn to the regular meeting of June 26th, 2014 at 7:30 p.m.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thanks very much.